Hello, welcome back to Human Depth Psychology.
Carl Jung documented a psychological shift so profound it terrified him. It occurs when the gentlest person you know finally reaches their limit. In his private practice, Jung observed a recurring, disturbing pattern among his most sensitive patients, individuals we would now call empaths. They arrived appearing fragile, carrying the weight of others' pain, apologizing for their own existence. But hidden beneath this accommodating exterior was a latent, formidable power. Jung discovered that these individuals weren't simply victims. They were unconscious strategists, and their moment of snapping was not a breakdown, but a terrifyingly precise awakening. Welcome to Winds of Thought. Today, we explore Jung's most unsettling case studies, the moment the empath integrates their shadow and becomes psychologically invulnerable. Jung's notes from his Zurich clinic reveal a consistent story. Patient after patient came to him bearing the invisible scars of emotional shock absorption. They had spent lifetimes as the emotional regulators for alcoholic parents, unfaithful partners, and dysfunctional families. Society had taught them their profound sensitivity was a flaw, something to be muted. But Jung began to suspect something else. Their minds weren't broken. They were operating on a different, more complex frequency. What chilled Jung wasn't their suffering, but their silent, meticulous observation. When he asked them to describe their abusers, he expected fragmented, emotional recollections. Instead, he received something closer to a psychological dossier. These empaths had, without conscious intent, mapped the emotional patterns of those around them with clinical accuracy. They knew the triggers, the insecurities, the hidden wounds of everyone who had hurt them. They had never used this knowledge, not until a final, devastating betrayal forced their hand. Jung realized he wasn't treating passive victims. He was in the presence of what he called unconscious geniuses. Their gift wasn't in creating, but in perceiving. To test this, he introduced colleagues to these patients without context. Within minutes, the empaths could identify core childhood wounds, relational patterns, and deep-seated fears with unnerving precision. Their accuracy wasn't mystical. It was the result of hyper-attention. Their brains were wired for advanced behavioral pattern recognition. What society called oversensitivity was, in reality, a sophisticated data processing system constantly analyzing human emotion. The crisis, the snap, always followed the same arc. It was triggered by a profound betrayal, often from the very person the empath had most protected. The twist was this: the empath had seen the signs all along and had consciously chosen to ignore them, favoring hope over evidence. When the truth became undeniable, something extraordinary happened. Contrary to expectation, they didn't erupt in chaos. They became unnervingly calm. This was the moment of integration. The suppressed analytical mind fused with the feeling heart. Jung called this shadow work. The empath's shadow wasn't malice. It was their own denied strength, their silenced intuition, their right to self-preservation. In this state of icy clarity, they began to speak. Not to accuse, but to articulate. They laid out the entire history of the dysfunction they had observed and endured, point by devastating point, with the detachment of a scientist presenting findings. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an audit of the soul. This transformation, Jung noted, was permanent. These individuals didn't revert to people-pleasing. They established boundaries with the finality of stone walls. They stopped doubting their own perceptions. They had become what manipulators fear most, an empath who cannot be gaslit. Jung documented how their entire lives reconfigured. They left toxic systems with strategic efficiency. They attracted healthy relationships because they could now spot emotional predators instantly. Their presence alone began to change their social ecosystems. Manipulative individuals grew nervous around them, sensing their usual tactics were now transparent. Jung, himself a sensitive individual, was deeply unsettled. He followed these patients for years and discovered something that kept him awake. Their success was monumental. Their businesses thrived on an almost preternatural understanding of client needs. Their personal lives flourished because their discernment was now impeccable. They had not lost their empathy. They had refined it into a precision tool. They could, theoretically, manipulate with ease, understanding psychological pressure points instinctively. The terrifying and beautiful truth Jung observed was that they chose not to. They used their power for protection and creation, not destruction. Their awakened state created what we might call a mirror effect. Their mere presence forced everyone around them to evolve or reveal their true nature. Toxic people expose themselves through desperate attempts to regain control, while healthy individuals felt seen and safe. Dysfunctional family systems collapsed, not because the empath attacked them, but because they stopped volunteering as the emotional dumpster. Jung identified clear stages in this metamorphosis, which he saw as a natural, if traumatic, psychological evolution. The first stage was recognition. The empath finally stopped pathologizing their own perceptions. They began to trust their emotional intelligence as the valid, sophisticated system it was. They acknowledged their right to anger, to boundaries, and to their own analytical power. The second stage was integration. This was the fusion of light and shadow. They learned to hold both profound compassion and unyielding strength simultaneously. They became what Jung termed psychologically complete, able to extend kindness where it was earned and enforce consequences where it was needed. The third stage was strategic application. This was the most fascinating development for Jung. These individuals learned to navigate human systems with masterful awareness. They became psychological architects, building lives and relationships with intentionality, seeing manipulation coming from a distance and disarming it before it could take root. They became virtually immune to psychological abuse while deepening their capacity for authentic connection. The final stage was what Jung saw as the natural return to service. The integrated empath didn't become cold. They became selectively generous. They often used their hard-won insight to guide others, creating networks of resilience. Jung began to see empathic sensitivity not as a pathology, but as an advanced evolutionary trait operating in a hostile environment. This led Jung to a disturbing ethical realization. This transformation, if induced without a moral core, could create supremely skilled manipulators. His case files on this phenomenon became some of his most guarded writings. He knew this knowledge could be weaponized. So, what is the essential truth Jung uncovered? The empath's snap is not a loss of kindness, but the birth of conscious choice. It is the transition from unconscious absorption to conscious discernment. The empath does not become less feeling, they become perfectly feeling, which means they also know what and whom to feel for. Modern psychology echoes Jung's findings. Individuals who integrate their shadow aspects develop remarkable resilience. They cannot be gaslit because they trust their inner compass absolutely. They cannot be manipulated because they recognize the game before the first move is made. Their greatest tragedy, as Jung noted, is not their sensitivity, but how long they are taught to dishonor it. If you see yourself in this pattern, if you have ever felt like a sponge for the world's emotions, only to reach a point of silent, crystalline clarity after a betrayal, understand this. You were not breaking. You were awakening. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your latent strength gathering itself. The integrated empath is not a colder person. They are a clearer one. The world doesn't need more martyred empaths. It needs more awakened ones. Individuals who can feel the depths of human emotion without drowning in them. Who can see the complexity of human motive without becoming cynical. Who can love fiercely while protecting their own spirit with equal ferocity. This is Jung's vision of psychological evolution. If this exploration of depth psychology resonated with you, please like this video. It helps winds of thought reach others navigating this profound inner shift. I'd love to hear in the comments, have you experienced a moment where deep sensitivity transformed into quiet, unshakable strength? Remember Jung's final, potent insight. Never underestimate someone who has learned to trust their own perceptions completely. That is the day the true power awakens.